Welcome to the Australiana Fund's 7th online lecture for 2023. My name's Sonia Abbey. I'm the Fine Art Advisor for the Australiana Fund. Before we begin, I'd like to note that this lecture is being recorded and will be available to view on our website in the coming weeks. Links to past lectures are already shown on the homepage. I'll now hand you over to Jennifer Sanders, Chair of the Australiana Fund.
Thank you, Sonia, and welcome everyone. So good that so many of you have joined us tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm zooming in this evening. I'd also like to pay respect to their elders past, present and future, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Mathew Trinca presenting the lecture tonight. It's called Collecting and Exhibiting for the Nation. The acquisition of the Trevor Kennedy Collection by the National Museum of Australia marked a high point in the work of this national institution devoted to telling the Australian story. More than 5,000 pieces of fine art and Australiana, collected over more than 60 years, were acquired in what was the most significant addition to the National Historical Collection since the museum opened its doors in Canberra in 2001. On the eve of stepping down from his post, Matt Trinca will speak about this acquisition and other key moments in his decade as Director of the National Museum. Dr. Mathew Trinca, AM FAHA, has been Director of the National Museum of Australia since February 2014. He is also presently a Commissioner for Culture and Olympic Heritage, advising the International Olympic Committee. He's Chair of Blue Shield Australia and former Chair of ICOM Australia. Matt, many thanks for joining us tonight. We're really looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, and thank you to everybody who's joining this presentation tonight. Can I begin by acknowledging the First Nations of the lands that I'm on here in Canberra, the Ngunnawal, Ngunnawal, Ngambri peoples, and just to reflect in this year's quite momentous year on how grateful I am, and indeed the museum is, to receive the welcome it does from the First Nations people of this place. And I really do thank the elders, those that have been and those that are with us now, and those that are really developing and into leadership positions within their communities, for all the friendship and amity that exists in the relationship between the museum and all those peoples. It's a great pleasure to be with you this evening. I'm very grateful for the invitation that the Australiana Fund has extended to me to speak a little about things dear to my heart. That is, more specifically, how we represent the nation and its history through our collections. And I'm just going to share my screen with you. I hope you can all see that now. As we go through this evening, I want to show you some slides really relating to some of the themes and ideas, and indeed some of the objects that I'll be speaking about. I'm also pleased, I suppose, to have the opportunity, because really I'm on the eve now, as Jennifer says, of departing from my job as director of this fine institution. And it's given me an opportunity to really reflect on all that has happened here, not just in the 10 years since I've been director, but of course, unusually, I was promoted from within the organisation. And so I've been here 20 years. And I joined the National Museum of Australia from the Western Australian Museum, where I began my career. And in so many respects, I'm grateful for this chance now to think a little about certainly what the period of my directorship has meant, and indeed, by extension, also how I feel about having spent the past 2 decades devoted to this national institution. You know, the sense of working at a national and international level was in many respects very different to what I'd experienced in the earlier part of my career in Perth. I thought when I came to Canberra that the experience working in this museum, the National Museum, would be much like working at the Western Australian Museum. How naive could I be? In fact, it was so very different, because the relationship to government, and indeed the institution's place in an ongoing public dialogue, really, about what it means to be Australian was very different to what the experience of working at the museum in Perth had been. I know it's an overused term, but I really do feel a great sense of privilege to have worked here these 20 years. It's a rare thing to have had the opportunity to devote the greater part of one's working life to a single institution these days. So often, and so many of the staff that we have here at the museum have had experiences of working in many other places before they come here, or indeed after they leave. In my case, I joined the institution in 2003 as a senior curator when Australia, indeed the museum itself, was in the grip of the culture wars, with very hotly contested arguments that were raised about the place of First Nations peoples in our understanding of the Australian past, and the truth of our past, that in founding modern Australia, the First Nations peoples of the continent had been devastated by disease, violence, and dispossession on a grand scale, that the conquest of the continent was in so many respects marked by a series of wars. That was not wholly accepted at that time. Now, I think it's very different now. People, of course, have very divergent views about it, but I think there's a common acceptance now that the nation's past, for all the good and bad in it, the acceptance of that past enlarges us as a national community. A sense of honesty that we can bring to the discussions about the past actually make us bigger. They make us better than we otherwise would be. And that's as much true by accepting that which is challenging and difficult, and of course, all that is wondrous and meritorious in the Australian story. You know, I tend to Noel Pearson's view that our nation's traditions of the long history of the First Nations of the continent, reaching back 65,000 years, of the foundations of British law and society that in so many ways are the bedrock of the nation, and the cultures and traditions of all who've come together after that time, and including my own forebears from Italy, have made this nation their home, and altogether we comprise a national community with its own unique and distinctive history. It's our history. It's what we give to ourselves, but also we give to the world. And it's part of the storytelling of the human experience and indeed what it means to live on this earth. Now, those three great narratives are in so many ways at the centre of this museum's work, I think, to document, to research, to represent Australia's history and experience. And in fulfilling that responsibility, the museum has much in common, I think, in terms of its practice with the work of the Australiana Fund. It makes it a special treat for me to be speaking to you tonight on behalf of the fund. You know, both organisations are really devoted to the idea that our collections of material culture, our collections of things, say something deep and instructive about the nation we were, the nation we are, and the nation that we wish to be in the future. And both the museum and the fund are really impelled by, I think, this idea that the past matters, not just because it's the past, but because it's tied inextricably to our present. And in so many ways, it's a predicate for all that is to come. To collect, then, in the way that we do, both the museum and the fund, is not just to record the past, but it's also to reflect on our present circumstances and to imagine in turn all that might lie ahead. Now, I have the clearest example of the truth of this, I think, in the work that the National Museum did with this institution that you're seeing on screen now. I love this old image of the British Museum in London. And of course, many years ago, we joined with our colleagues there under the directorship of Neil McGregor, who'll be known to some of you, to undertake twin exhibitions in London and Canberra with the earliest collections of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artefacts known anywhere in the world. Most of them in the collections, indeed, of the British Museum. And working together, both the BM and the NMA, with 30 First Nations communities around the country, from Albany to the Torres Strait, from the Kimberley to Tasmania, and all points in between, we worked assiduously to try and connect people with artefacts that were held half a world away in London, and which in almost all cases had not been seen in this country since their collection in the 18th, 19th and early 20th centuries. And as a result, our exhibition in Canberra, I think, was a truly groundbreaking piece of work. It effectively returned these things to our shores, some of them collected, as I'm about to speak a little more about, by James Cook in that first fateful landfall on Australia's east coast. Some of them collected in that voyage in 1770 and then beyond. Now, it was a risky enterprise on all fronts. It was work we knew to be important in advancing the interests of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities that we were working with, the source communities for these things. And we were encouraged to really try to look forward and understand our history in new ways, rather than, in a sense, looking back to all the particular circumstances that had led to the collections being effectively distanced from their communities in the way that they had been for so long. And the Prince of Wales, then Prince of Wales, now King Charles III, was a patron of both exhibitions and indeed the accompanying research project. And the exhibitions Indigenous Australia, Enduring Civilisations in London and Encounters in Canberra, I think affected many people deeply. I know a party of neighbours, really, of mine in the area around Yass, not far from Canberra, whose family had been farming in that district since the 1840s. And they remarked to me after seeing the exhibition, they felt deeply moved by what was contained in the show, and that they responded positively, very positively, to having been encouraged, but not lectured, to think about our shared past in different terms. Now, this was just 8 years ago, and my hope at the time was that the dialogue which the exhibitions really enabled might lead to further developments in the future. And I thought that in establishing these connections between source communities in this country and institutions in the United Kingdom that were holding these precious things, we might begin a conversation about how those links might develop and flourish to the benefit both of First Nations peoples here, but indeed enlarge the life of those museums abroad. But I have to tell you, not even I fully realised how quickly things might move. You see here the shield and spears that were collected by Cook that actually sat at the centre of the Encounters exhibition. This slide gives you a sense of what that display looked like. And the spears had been held since they arrived in London. They'd actually travelled to Cambridge University and been held by the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology there ever since. So it was the first time that they'd returned to Australia in 2015. And of course, both the spears and the shield, although the shield subsequently is now surrounded by some conjecture, but the spears are undeniably those collected by Cook. And they are really at the very centre of our history, indeed this idea of our shared history. And they are especially considered to be cultural treasures by the La Perouse community that are really the descendants of those people met by Cook and his crew more than 250 years ago. Now, working together with the museum in Cambridge and the La Perouse community, we brought those spears back again in 2020 for the exhibition that actually addressed the 250th anniversary of the landing at Kurnell. And then, unexpectedly in some respects, this year, the La Perouse community and the museum in Cambridge jointly announced that those spears would be repatriated to Australia permanently. And I think it's an astonishing development, an incredibly symbolic moment, and one in which the National Museum is proud to have played a part. It's a moment that brings past, present, and future all together, which shows what's possible from being honest about our past in building bridges, working together in the present in ways that lend us hope and will, I hope, make our future one that is shared equitably and honourably. And I said earlier that our story is one that is distinctive and unique, and which we contribute to the global storytelling of humans on the planet. And it's not meant to sound grandiose. I don't mean to sound overblown, but rather to recognise the fact that what has happened on this continent is important in the fuller telling of the story of humanity around the globe. And we can afford, I think, to be confident and clear in telling that story to others, not just to ourselves. And you can see in this work with the British Museum that the National Museum has that strong view about the role it should play in telling our story abroad. It's one of the things I'm proudest of, really, in terms of our work over recent years. And altogether, the museum has sent displays and exhibitions to more than 25 nations over the past 10 years, in many cases working with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade through their missions overseas. And in fact, one of our innovations has been to create digital packages for supply to our embassies for our missions abroad, who can then arrange with local suppliers to create their own displays using our content. One of those you see here, a selection of works from the Canning Stock Group collection that were reproduced and hung in one of the central parks in Mexico City a few years ago. We've taken also major exhibitions of original works to key nations in our region, to China, Japan, Singapore, and Taiwan, amongst others. And notably in recent years, we've had major touring exhibitions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art in both China and Japan. This was the exhibition of our great collection of bark paintings from Arnhem Land, installed at the National Museum of China on Tiananmen Square. An extraordinary moment to have representatives from that community in that museum for the opening all those years ago and speaking about their perspective on those works being shown at the heart of that country in Beijing. And then we've also taken the Canning Stock Group collection to the National Art Museum of China in the same cities. And both institutions have also sent major exhibitions to Canberra, an important cultural exchange that's played a part in maintaining relationships despite the periodic difficulties we've experienced in that relationship, as the former Prime Minister, John Howard, noted several years ago. Now, one of the great successes that has come from this international dimension of our work has been the tour of the award-winning and acclaimed Songlines exhibition, which I know some of you will have seen during its Canberra run several years ago, or perhaps indeed in Perth when it opened that new museum in 2020 during the COVID pandemic. The exhibition is really a grand exposition of the Seven Sisters Jukupa, or dreaming stories of First Nations people across a vast swathe, the vast extent of Australia's interior, ranging really across the lands of the Mathew peoples, the peoples of the MPY lands, and then in Central Australia on the APY lands. And it's a grand mythopoeic tale of the pursuit of seven sisters across this vast and varied landscape by a shape-shifting sorcerer, Wati Niru. It's really one of our First Nations answers to the great epics of countries, societies abroad, to the Homeric epics of ancient Greece, the European saga of Beowulf, or indeed the Mesopotamian Odyssey of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the Seven Sisters stories are among the enduring tales of this land, evolving and passed down over so many thousands of years. Last year, the exhibition opened here in Berlin, and that's the director of the Humboldt Forum, Helmut Dogelow, there with traditional owners from Central Australia who were introducing some of the works in the show to him. And it was remarkable to open that exhibition with a broadcast, a simultaneous broadcast between us here in Canberra and our colleagues there in Berlin at the start of what proved to be a very successful run. And this year, Songlines has just concluded a run in the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, one of the great global centres of culture. Here you see the Prime Minister opening really a spin-off from the exhibition, a multimedia piece called Walking Through a Songline that's touring Southeast Asia. And Prime Minister Albanese opened this exhibition, this experience in Phnom Penh last November as part of Australia's participation in ASEAN. And next year, Songlines will tour to Finland and then on to the Saatchi Gallery in London before travelling to venues in Canada and the United States. And at all venues, senior knowledge holders from First Nations communities that have shared their Seven Sisters stories in the show will be travelling, expressing their continuing strength of their culture. And as an aside, the senior curator, Margot Neal, who many of you will know, responsible for bringing all this work together, has also had great success with this series of books jointly published by Random House and the National Museum of Australia as part of our scholarly program. Margot's both the general editor of the series, but also authored this first title in the Songlines stream. And it's really been her vision for the books being co-authored collaboratively by an Indigenous and a non-Indigenous scholar that has been so successful. And we're now working on a children's series based on these titles. All these works that I've just described, the work that we've taken abroad, have really relied on the simple truth that great museums hold great store by the quality of the collections that they have. And the great strengths of the National Museum's collections, that is the First Nations collections, are really those that are comprised of the former ethnographic collections of the now defunct Australian Institute of Anatomy. And you see also here one of the great Papunya works that came to us from the Aboriginal Arts Board. And indeed, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Arts Collection that was created really by successive agencies of the Commonwealth Government who were working in Indigenous affairs is also one of those constituent collections of the National Museum's National Historical Collection, which now numbers more than 275,000 items. These are all legacy collections, really, which came to the museum from other government departments and agencies soon after the passage of the National Museum of Australia Act in 1980. Relatively young museum, the National Museum of Australia. And bringing these great collections to public notice has obviously been one of the key responsibilities of the museum since that time. But of course, the work of collecting, documenting and researching the material culture of our nation is ongoing. And we've been fortunate at the museum to be able to add to these foundation collections through the $2 million annual acquisition budget that the museum has had over the past almost 20 years. It's really allowed us to both purchase works as well as to benefit from the donation of collections of others. And we've collected a great deal of work from Aboriginal art centres, for instance, that helped us illustrate those songlines narratives that were featured in the exhibition that I've just described. But there have been many other collections besides. And here you see the Holder #1 prototype, which was actually one of the earliest major acquisitions that I played a part in when I first joined the museum, sometime after 2003. And it was, this of course is the first experimental Holden, one of 3 brought to Australia to test the vehicle after having been built in Detroit, and which served as the model for the 48215, which helped launch the Australian car manufacturing industry after World War II. Of course, there's been great donations of works as well, like this example of this wonderful dress worn by one of the faithful sisters at a pastoral station near Goulburn, the Springfield collection documenting the life of that pastoral station from the 1830s to the present. A very great gift indeed when it came to us. And here is the coach that belonged to that collection, had been ordered from New York from Brewster and Co. Carriage Builders in 1889 and then freighted to Australia, where it was used by the Faithful family, William Pitt Faithful, had ordered it. It was used by the Faithful family for many years. That collection really includes such a vast array of things, from coaches, farming machinery, to fine and beautiful dresses of the sort that we've seen. But I have to say, for me, as Jennifer suggested at the start of this presentation, the proudest work in which I've been involved has been the acquisition of the Trevor Kennedy Collection, one of the greatest known collections of Australiana, and indeed a collection that really allows us to tell a range of stories within something that might comprise the social history of our nation. It took more than a decade of discussion and negotiation. And here you see the Trevor Kennedy Collection in situ, in premises that Trevor had established for the collection in Millers Point, in Kent Street and Millers Point in Sydney. As it happens, I actually began this negotiation with Trevor so many years ago while I was an assistant director here responsible for collections and content. And it went through an extraordinary ebb and flow of ideas about how we might acquire the collection, how much of it we could and should acquire. And as I said, there were the rises and falls of fortune and failure along the way. But finally, in 2021-22, this effort was completed with the transport of more than 5,500 precious objects from Millers Point, where Trevor had his own museum, to Canberra to join the rest of the National Historical Collection. And the collection in its entirety really exhibits an extraordinary and eclectic range. There are rare masterworks such as this extremely important portrait of Esther Abrahams, convict transporter, came to Sydney with the First Fleet on the Lady Penrhyn. Abrahams became the de facto wife of the Rum Rebellion leader, George Johnson, the pair having met while aboard a ship en route to Australia. They had 7 children, were eventually married in 1814. It's an extremely rare example that we have of that documents, if you like, the life of a convict woman. The next painting by Conrad Martins is the funeral of Rear Admiral Philip Arthur King, dated 1856. And it really captures the moment when thunder rolled and light rain fell as the boat carrying King's coffin made its way across Sydney Harbour, and the strokes of the rowers were slow and measured as a farewell salute echoed across the water at the time. Born on Norfolk Island, King had become a notable hydrographer and explorer, and his 4 expeditions between about 1817 and the early 1820s really made a significant contribution to the charting of the Australian coast. There is this extraordinary and treasured piece, this massive long case clock dated from 1827, made by watchmaker James Oatley of Stafford, who was England, who was transported for life and arrived in Sydney in 1815. And Governor Lachlan Macquarie, soon after he arrived, appointed him keeper of the town clock. In 1818, Oatley was awarded the commission to install the clock at Hyde Park Barracks. He received a conditional pardon in 1821, by which time he had a very successful business in George Street in Sydney. And his clocks, of which I think there are a few more than 20 known examples, are regarded as some of the finest pieces of colonial craftsmanship and are highly prized by collectors. And indeed, this is highly prized by the museum. You'll see here as well some examples of Australian cedar colonial-made furniture, which were also in the collection. Trevor acquired a great part of his collection from the great Ruth Simon collection. You can see here the lineages, the genealogy of the collection that he made in these pieces. There are also wonderful pieces of silver, including this centerpiece from around 1875, made by the celebrated colonial silversmith Henry Steiner. And centerpieces such as this one, which was exhibited at the 1880 Melbourne International Exhibition, were very popular presentation commissions at the time. And they're ornate, very elaborate items. They really allowed the silversmith to show their skill and ingenuity. And although based on European examples, these Australian-made instances featured very distinctly Australian motifs, such as Indigenous figures, kangaroos, and emus. Trevor had one of the largest collection known in private hands of carved emu eggs as well. Now, they're curious pieces to modern eyes, but they're extremely popular in the 19th century, and there were more than 60 of these pieces collected by Trevor over many years. This is a very special one, I think, very unusual, made by William Kerr, dated to 1885. And Kerr was an accomplished watchmaker, silversmith and jeweller, established a business with his brothers in Sydney in 1857, then worked for Hardy Brothers in the 60s to about 1875, when he opened his own store in George Street in 1882, best known for sporting trophies. And of course, this unusual piece, perhaps one of his finest, was presented by the Sydney Bicycle Club to Surrey Bicycle Club in England. You can see there the obvious signs of that. Jewellery was a special interest of Trevor's, and his collection had a very fine array of distinctive, iconic Australian pieces, and some were highly fashioned, like this wonderful gold and amethyst brooch, which includes, you can see there just at the top, the depiction of a First Nations person in this floral setting of Banksias and leaves. And then there were these wonderful Goldfields brooches. It's an extensive collection of those in Trevor's collection, very distinctive Australian forms. And you can see here, in a sense, all the accoutrements of a miner's life are depicted in this brooch made on the fields. This wonderful watercolour of eucalyptus blossom is, of course, by Ellis Rowan, the renowned watercolourist and illustrator. And the work is one of the largest known, most magnificent examples. It was bought in Australia in 1944 and taken overseas. And Trevor actually purchased it at auction in California, and obviously was therefore able to repatriate it to this country. There are these wonderful Prenzel carvings, a host of Prenzel carvings really, and also furniture. These are the kookaburra and the cockatoo from the second decade of the 20th century. Prenzel was born in Prussia and arrived in Australia as a qualified woodcarver and cabinet maker in his early 20s in 1888. He made a great deal of furniture and, of course, these wood carvings over the course of his long career. He became increasingly interested in celebrating Australian flora and fauna, and you can see that in these examples. This is a very special piece. I can see there that you've got its title twice. My apologies for that. It's a miniature that was painted by the convict artist Thomas Watling. Convicted of forgery, sentenced to 14 years transportation, Watling arrived in Sydney in 1792. He was assigned to White and put to work documenting the natural history of the colony, or in Watling's own words, painting, quote, the nondescript productions of the country. None too flattering, was he? White appreciated the artist's skills, and Watling always complained that the more he was appreciated, the more he was consigned to his life as a convict, and his emancipation was impeded. Now, Trevor had wide-ranging tastes, and so there are these wonderful curios, such as a vast array of pepper pots on Australian themes by the artist and potter Gray Seckham, and then very odd things such as this walking cane, quite outre really, a carving stick wrought from the penis bone of a blue whale. And Trevor always delighted in startling guests to his premises there in Kent Street with this story. Now, in sum, the Trevor Kennedy Collection is one that will be, I think, forevermore, one of the most treasured and central components of the National Historical Collection. A century, 2 centuries from now, I think that will be true. The wonder of it is that it came to us at all, to be honest. The story of its acquisition is instructive in terms of the patience and stoicism one needs to exhibit when you're making these major acquisitions. I first met Trevor around 2010 when he began considering the possible sale of the collection, built up over more than 50 years, almost 60 years since the 60s. And of course, you know, Trevor's reputation preceded him. He's a renowned journalist, businessman, particularly known for his leadership of Australian Consolidated Press under Kerry Packer. He created this great collection, as I say, acquiring many other major collections, such as that owned by Ruth Simon over many years. And he had this very wide-ranging, eclectic eye. You won't find a collection quite like Trevor's again for these great, rare pieces of Australiana, wonderful pictures, but then these, at times, fairly nondescript and very unknown pieces which tickled his fancy. And having acquired all these treasures, he bought that wonderful Georgian building in Millers Point that I know some of you will have seen to house them. At some point, he started thinking about the future and what would happen to the collection. His first instinct was really to sell the collection entire to an institution like ours or another museum in the country. And a series of valuations and the discussion that we had with him followed. And we arrived at a figure of about 25 million as a prospective purchase price. But of course, unsurprisingly, it was 25 million we didn't have at the National Museum at the time. We approached government in about 2011, but were unsuccessful in really securing the funds. And there the matter rested for a time. Trevor, though, never stopped thinking about the fact that we should be acquiring these collections. I'd run into him from time to time and he'd sort of peremptorily tell me that we should be buying his collection. Actually, he said it in more colourful language than that, but I don't think I could possibly repeat that this evening. I didn't disagree with him about it. I thought that it was a masterwork, really, for its range, breadth, and the diversity of its interests, but I wondered privately whether it would ever come to pass that the National Museum would acquire it. Eventually, after some years passed, we began to speak again about the prospect of acquiring the collection, or at least the greater part of the very historically important pieces. And after much negotiation, a good deal of work both by Trevor and his staff, and indeed the staff of the National Museum, you see here one of our senior officers, senior curator, Sophie Jensen, who did so much to advance this interest over the time that she worked with Trevor. Eventually, we struck a deal to buy a third of the collection over several years and for Trevor to gift another third, in value terms at least, to the museum, a very great gift worth about $8 million. And broadly speaking, the last third, valuable but of lesser historical importance, to be sold by Trevor himself through public auction. And the deal was finally approved by the government, federal government, in 2020. And it concluded, as you realise from this tale, a negotiation that began more or less a decade before. Now, you may have seen the first exhibition of these works from the collection 2 years ago. Another's now planned for the next few years, I'm pleased to be able to say to you tonight, together with a book on the collection for which Paul Keating has gratefully written a foreword. Trevor sadly passed away late in 2021. But thankfully lived to enjoy his pride of place at the opening of that first exhibition. I do think that it's a great tribute to him and to his wife, Christina, and indeed their family, that the collection is now in the care of the National Museum of Australia in the public interest. And undeniably, it will remain a highlight of the National Historical Collection for a long time to come. But why is this collection so important? Well, in the first instance, it is a vast collection of fabulous pieces which will continue to serve our needs for objects that tell all dimensions of the Australian story for many, many years to come. And when you think about its diversity, its eclecticism, It feels now as if the National Museum has a great capacity to range across themes and ideas about Australian experience, particularly in the 19th century, from a whole host of perspectives. But I think at the same time, the collection is important as a coherent whole that represents really the masterwork of this great Australian collector in Trevor, himself a very notable Australian for his work and his contribution to letters in this country and business. But I think it is this idea that the collection so encapsulates his spirit and his character that is one of the great strengths of this collection. One of the fortunes we had was to be able to record Trevor on video talking about the collection as he viewed it in his Millers Point premises. And that video archive really takes us deep into the mind and sensibility of a major collector. And you can see the collection itself as an artefact. It's an artefact entire, composed of those individual pieces, but ultimately which reveals how much Trevor loved and his belief in Australia and the Australian project in all its dimensions. I think at another level, this acquisition has really also reminded us of the great power of things to animate our history and to take us inside the experiences of people in the past. And that seems, to me, ever more important now in this age of digital transformation, perhaps more important than it's ever been. You know, we stand at one of the great crossroads, I think, in human history, with all that this fourth industrial revolution, as Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum might say, all that the fourth industrial revolution is bringing to us. Artificial intelligence that'll surpass us in so many respects. Robotics that are taking over many of our physical tasks and work. Nanotechnology that can enter our bodies and cure us. And a host of communications technologies that now connect us instantly with anyone around the world at a moment's notice. And all this is creating change on a scale that I think none of us have ever seen before. Change bigger, I think, than that we experienced as agrarianism gave way to industrialism in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. None of us quite know where all of this is going. The ramifications are still, I think, very often opaque and unclear to us of this great digital turn, this great digital change. It's not easy to be a soothsayer at any time with any sense of clarity or precision, but it's especially difficult now. But what I think is clear is that the character and experience of human life is changing dramatically, and there are real dangers in us developing a kind of social amnesia of what we've been and done in the past. And we know how hard this is to negotiate in our own lives. It's immensely challenging, but it does suggest, I think, an enhanced importance in our commitment to galleries, museums, libraries, and archives, these collecting institutions which hold the distilled proceeds of our culture and society over time. So all these collections like the Trevor Kennedy Collection, the Great Arnhem Land Bark Collection that I showed you before, the Papunya Collection and others, are reminders of our embodied and intellectual natures as human beings. They're material artifacts made by people for varying motivations and reasons, and they express something of their makers and by extension, something about all of us. They're also ciphers of ideas about our relationships to place and to each other, about our needs and our capacity to address those needs through invention and creative enterprise of all sorts. When I look at these things that I've shown you tonight, I can't help but thinking how all these things embed us in a web, a kind of a network of stories and contexts that are so rich and revealing about who we are. It's the sheer authenticity of these things, of these collections, that I think will be more important as we deal increasingly with the world of fakery online. Given that artificial intelligence can now immediately conjure up images, that are effectively unreal, that are artificial, and replicate things or people that we might recognise and know in our lives, it's difficult to be completely sure about what we're seeing or what we're reading. And so in that respect, I think collections in our great museums and elsewhere that help us understand the essential character of human experience that is produced by our physical natures as much as our creative enterprise, our thinking, will be increasingly important. And that's why I think the work that we do, both in the National Museum and indeed the Australiana Fund, will thrive and become ever more important and ever more valued as great repositories of human experience and meaning. And the collections we make are not just about the desire for beautiful things or to represent key moments in our past or because of nostalgia for that past, because they make sense, they help us make sense of who we are and what we might be. They're cultural mnemonics. They take us into an understanding of our lives. And for that, I'm grateful for the work of the Australiana Fund, as I'm grateful for the work of the museum here, the National Museum. And I cannot tell you how grateful I am also for the chance to have played a part in recording these aspects of life on the continent in ways that might help us navigate what seems an increasingly volatile and uncertain future. Thank you for the opportunity I've had to share some of these ideas and some of these reflections about my work here tonight. And with that, I hope to give you at least an opportunity now for a few questions. Jennifer.
Thank you, Mathew, very much. I'm hoping I'm on screen. Sonia gave me some instructions, but I'll talk anyway. That was really a considered, thoughtful and reflective, but forward-thinking paper, Mathew. I think that you have given us all not only a sense of a museum that has done so much in 1980, it's not a long time, but has now got a sort of a legacy that's not only full of history, but it's full of our future. I particularly valued the scope that gave us the personal to the global, the reach way back in time, thousands and thousands of years through First Nations to the very contemporary. And I think your thoughtfulness, and we were talking about this before, before the lecture started, about museums' place in our society, particularly when we had all the uncertainties of COVID, etc. And then for you to talk now about AI, robotics, the immersive experience that seems to be becoming, an alternate for some people to a museum experience. But coming back to the fact that these are hand and mind objects, they are made by people thinking, skills, and taking backwards, the Powerhouse Museum, it's hand and mind that underpins that. And both Museum, National Museum, Powerhouse, and the Australiana Fund's collection are all about stories of making, using, sharing, talking about, etc. So it's really a wonderful, wonderful presentation, Matt. I was particularly pleased to see your long case clock come up on screen because I'm reminded of the Fund's long case clock by Oatley, 1827, which is in the main hallway of Government House. We have descendants of William Kerr who were members of the Fund. And of course, we have works by Ellis Rowan. So while we're a small collection, it was very, very useful, and I think gave us a context for the Fund's collection in terms of a national collection. So thank you very much for that, Matt. We have got some questions, and this one you'll love because you have to make a choice. Do you have a favourite artwork in the Kennedy Collection? And that's very difficult because those of us who've seen anything.
That's right. There's so many. Yeah. You know that collection well too.
Yeah.
Look, I do really value that portrait of Esther Abrams because I just think it's so wonderful to have that sense of being able to look at the face of that woman who experienced the convict system and then went on remarkably to have this great, family and a place in society. In so many ways, that story mimics so many others of convicts who found their way, it has to be said, through transportation. I'm also I'm very fond of Trevor's collection. I didn't speak about it much tonight around Federation. And there are extensive materials related to Federation. There's a wonderful compendium of all the invitations that were sent out, like a printer's first proofs of everything, all the events that really comprise the Federation celebrations. And it's just such a palpable reminder of the sense of delight and emotional excitement that attended Federation. And I think it reminds me of a great late friend in John Hurst and his book, The Sentimental Nation, that John was very intent on trying to restore an idea that there was real feeling, passion and emotion in the Federation, because we'd become so reconciled to the idea that this was just kind of compact for business purposes, the coming together of the colonies. So I love that as well. But quite honestly, there's so much in the collection. It's a treasure trove.
Yeah. Well, I think that first exhibition that you put on when it was handed over, yes, it had all the classics, the beautiful drawings of the kookaburras, etc., but the cases with the pepper and salt shakers.
Yeah, they're great.
And that was just like, it was like a Luna Park. Yeah. It was really wonderful. And I think I can see there'll be a whole series of Kennedy Collection exhibitions, whether they're a little case or a giant, celebration of the whole thing come out. I do.
And of course, that Ellis Rowan picture is fabulous as well. And it's presently on display because, of course, there are elements on permanent display at the museum as well as these occasional exhibitions that we've made. So, yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant. Now, someone has asked, Ian, where are you heading after this?
That's a very kind question. Well, I mean, I certainly 20 years is enough. And I do have a very strong view. I was asked, by many people why I wasn't going on, particularly as you might realise that in April, we finally secured support from government at the level that we'd been desperate for part of the last decade, really. And now the future of the museum is assured, not just us, but indeed all the national institutions for the next 4 years. And that's a very great sum, $80 million over 4 years.
Well, that is a major achievement, I have to say.
I am very pleased. It's
seriously not many museums in the world would have that.
No, I'm I look expectantly to the next director to be grateful for all that hard work put in to secure the funds. But the truth is, I think that institutions need change, Jennifer, and especially in the CEO. And I do think 10 years is enough. And I had that view strongly before. And I suppose in many ways I was aware that it was easy to sort of resolve from that view when you get closer to the date. And so last year I actually went out and said to the board, I am leaving next year. And it was a good thing because it's kept me up to the mark. What comes next, I hope, is a little more time with family, a bit more time on the property we have in the Brindabellas, and some consulting and contract work. I will do it 2 or 3 days a week if I can, and if people think they've got enough to share in their organisations in the years to come.
Well, there'll always be a lecture circuit for you with the Australiana Fund.
That's very kind, Jennifer.
Because, the other point, I think you made the point about cultural diplomacy. And in a way, the fund, that's what Tammy Fraser set it up to be.
Yeah, indeed.
It's a physical, cultural diplomat, an expression of Australia, who we are, what are the passions and the key moments, but also the sort of distinctiveness of the country. Yeah. And while the numbers are very different in terms of people visiting a museum, but in terms of the numbers who go into the official residences, ranging from the school groups to every single head of state. It is quite a wide reach when you think of what that little collection is doing. So it's been nice to think of the parallels between the big national collection of the National Museum and what is really a unique organisation that came about because, you know, Mrs. Fraser said it's not good enough, you know, what we have in the houses, and that, you know, got a lot of momentum at the time because people supported it. So it's wonderful when we have support of people like yourselves and other institutions in the work that we do. And I'm getting a lot of positive statements and comments, if I can read the chat function. And people are very appreciative about the critical importance of material artifacts made by people and their authenticity. People question about whether, you know, people have offered collections, haven't always been taken. Is it because of lack of storage space? I mean, I think your point about the $2 million acquisition fund per annum, probably anyone who's worked anywhere near a museum or a collecting institution went, wow, that's a really solid foundation to build any collection. It could be that's the background to a number of.
Well, look, I think it is always a challenge for institutions to take everything they're offered. We're very grateful for it, though, I have to say, and value the fact that people think of us and bring material, to us. Sometimes it can be about the collections frame that an institution has, and it's saying, look, it's trying to collect in certain areas and not in others at a particular phase. Sometimes it can be that they simply are confronted by the desperate circumstances they have around storage. You're right. I think most museums in the country now find great difficulty in feeling assured about storage. Most of us have problems. Not all of us feel restful. And when I think about the fact, Jennifer, that the Piggott report in the mid-1970s really elaborated a plan for the cultural heritage of nation in that report, presented on the same day, I think, that Whitlam was dismissed in November. I think the date is the 11th of November. It was stamped when it was presented to Parliament. That report then spoke about the great concern that they had for the conservation of our cultural heritage and the inadequacy of storage. And you come forward all these years and you find us still wrestling with the same problems. And it's because it's very difficult to convince the holders of the public purse about the merits of the very unsexy business of storing collections as much as acquiring them. But, we continue to do work to try and improve storage and hopefully to be able to take collections such as those that have been suggested to you tonight.
Yeah, I think the storage too, it's almost as if we need a different name other than storage, particularly now because there's so much of the collections that are accessible online. I mean, even the Funds collection is starting to come out on Trove. Trove was only just saved recently, we almost got that as well. But even institutions' collection records online are doing a great job. But in a way, it's got to be underpinning the importance of the object itself, and that storage or accessible storage is a good way to go. But it's that tangible heritage that's so critical to the sense of the nation, having its own character and its own past and its own future. And you really spoke about that so well tonight. I think people will not only reflect on that when they visit the National Museum, but I think any collection, they're the same principles in terms of why have we got it, what is it for, who's it important to. So thank you very much, Matt, for your time tonight. And I'm sure that will be a lecture that many people are watching again and again, because there's so much in it and so much to learn about what the National Museum has contributed. So thank you very much indeed.
That's very kind, Jennifer, and thank you to everyone involved in this tonight, to yourself, to Sonia Abbey and Caroline Johnson, and indeed all the members of the fund. And keep up the great work, because, I'm a great believer in the work of the fund. I do think what you're doing is making a collection that has its own salience and importance in terms of national self-meaning, and I really commend you for all you do.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Okay, bye. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us.